So, the people who like accuse literally anyone who is like a generic sort of liberal who supports, or even if they don't say they're a liberal, they're still liberal, but like who supports like American exceptionalism, generic neoliberal sort of dogma, etc. When someone sees someone like that and they accuse them of being a fucking CIA agent or something, or like a paid shill, that doesn't really make much sense as an explanation. Like, let's look at Vorsh, for example. When you look at someone like Vorsh, you would say, like, how did someone like Vorsh become such a big streamer? How did he get what he believes, and how did he become such a big streamer talking about it? Well, for one, he believes what he believes because it's the sort of shit that if you're an American, and many other countries too, it's similar, like you're fed your entire life through the education system, through the media, through like even the most innocuous things sort of like impart the dominant ideology into you, right? Everyone knows that. It's at least if you're a leftist, it's the most basic thing ever. The propaganda model explains part of it, and the rest of it, it's so obvious that like people were talking about it 200 years ago. Okay, Marx and Engels talked about it extensively. Well, the bourgeoisie, with their control of society, are able to sort of impose their ideology onto it through influence on the government, control of the media, etc. And yeah, Gramsci has a lot to do with this too. Foucault also has not particularly related to the Marxist ones, but his concept of governmentality is very useful for this sort of thing. Essentially, in a way, saying that like it's ideal for governments to try and get you to govern yourself by their rules rather than having to impose things upon you. And that's basically what they do in the Western world, especially. They are masterful at that. Like they get people to believe so much in what they want them to believe that they don't even need to use to like directly oppress them as much. So it creates a sort of illusion of freedom that's not really there. But anyway, yeah. So as I was saying, like, yeah, Vorsh would be a liberal imperialist or whatever, which he is, American exceptionalism, etc., just because that's the dominant ideology in society. That's what we would expect of him, right? And then we could say, well, how did he become popular then? Was it because of support from the CIA? Well, what's more likely is because Vorsh is someone who reaffirms like the dominant ideology, justifies and holds up what is like the common dogma of American and Western society, etc. It's natural that the other people in these societies who believe all the same sorts of things would gravitate towards him and give him an audience. That's why all of the most popular, like everything, are things that essentially uphold liberal ideology for that very reason. So that's not surprising either. And Vorsh and others like him also have a sort of extra appeal in that they try to like present themselves as like rebellious, like not being aligned with the system, even though they obviously are. And that sort of like gives people, more incentive to follow him. It's like, oh, he's teaching me something subversive, when what he's really doing is like reinforcing what they already believe, but in a way that can make them feel special. So he's telling them things that are very palatable to their ears, but that in a way that makes them feel like they are unique and like out of the mainstream, when really they're just upholding it. So none of that requires any input from the CIA or whatever. It doesn't make any sense to assume that these streamers or whoever the fuck else who reproduces the dominant ideology is upheld by the CIA or federal funding or whatever. That's what you would expect. You would expect people like this to be propped up just by like the way the system is designed, the way people are fed propaganda for their entire life and sort of indoctrinated into the dominant ideology. You would expect this. It's completely anti-materialist to look at this and assume that the CIA is involved or something. It doesn't make any sense. The CIA doesn't need to mislead people into following liberalism, American exceptionalism, etc., because the CIA was essentially created in order to shut down the few segments of society that don't follow that dogma. That's their job. And they aren't as active as you may think either, but that's sort of out of the point. Like, it's anti-materialist to see something completely normal and expected, like a liberal political commentator, and be like, wow, that's CIA. It doesn't make any sense. Because the average American is not funded by the CIA, but nonetheless believes most of what the CIA would want them to believe. Now, obviously, there are a lot of like well-funded liberalism or capitalism, etc., advocacy groups. This is how neoliberalism spread through think tanks. But that's generally completely above board, mostly above board, especially in the Western world. It's very above board. It's very public. They don't hide who they're funded by because they don't need to. Because when the average person like sees like a neoliberal think tank, they don't think like what we do, like, oh, that's bullshit. They're spreading like a bullshit narrative with money from businessmen, and crafting a narrative that just so happens to benefit the interests of that businessman. No. When they see that and they're like, wow, this research looks very credible, and it says things that reaffirm what I've already been taught to believe for my entire life. Ergo, this is awesome. So there's no reason for them to be clandestine about it most of the time. In fact, most of the time, like most of what the CIA does in terms of like spreading that sort of thing, just like bog standard liberalism, is they actually do it in other countries where these ideas haven't taken hold as much due to like, generally because the state, like the dissemination of information isn't as complete as it is in the US, for example, not as much internet and not as much dissemination of newspapers, etc. So people are more prone to be radicalized. You know, the centralization of education isn't as much, etc., etc. So that's why you get like things like CIA coups. The CIA literally spending $10 million to fund a fucking newspaper, as they did in Chile. Stuff like that in the third world, but not necessarily in the US itself, because it's not really needed in the US. Because the US has really the world's most advanced propaganda apparatus. It has the world's most complacent population as a result as well, the world's most indoctrinated population as a result. So the CIA needs to help out other countries and other states that don't have such a well-developed and all-encompassing propaganda apparatus, because that population do not govern themselves, as Foucault would say, as well as the US population does. So they need to be sort of, disciplined into line. He'd like that too, given his discipline on younger Thebes. So when you see a liberal content creator, generally you should probably assume that they're popular just because most people agree with what they have to say already, and it's logical that they would get lots of views for that. And if any of them are funded, it would be a minority, and you would expect most of they're funded by completely above-board public stuff like think tanks, etc. More so than covert agency, because there's no need to hide advocacy for the dominant ideology. That's not something that needs to be hidden, at least in the US. In other countries, yeah, sometimes. It was especially funny too because those proletarian patriot people on Twitter were like saying that like not upholding the US flag is a psyop. That's so fucking funny. Like apparently the CIA doesn't want people to uphold the symbols of US nationalism. They want to undermine American nationalism and this American nationalist symbolism like the flag. So I guess they must be paying all the people in the third world and shit in US victim countries who burn the US flag or something. Amazing stuff. Like anyone whose first impulse, or even like their first 5 or 10 impulses upon being confronted with someone with shitty opinions or whatever, or whose opinions they disagree with, is to claim like CIA intelligence op is a complete idiot who doesn't know what historical materialism is, just engaging in complete idiocy, engaging in needless conspirational narratives that have no factual basis to them whatsoever, rather than going for the obvious fucking narrative, which is that they believe that because that's what society tells them and what it's told their audience their entire lives. If anything, the ones who would be like the CIA op would be these random patriotic socialists who just popped up like in the last 6 months to a year. Like spreading, like basically arguing with everyone remotely on the left and just like wasting everyone's fucking time while just happening to advocate for like US nationalism, which the CIA just happens to want them, just happens to want people to believe in. So if there's anyone who's like from a logical standpoint most likely to be a fucking federal op, it would be those people. But I'm not going to say that they are. I don't think they're a CIA op. I just think they're a bunch of fucking You know, you can explain them materially too, right? Like, these are just people who like want to like claim to be leftists, but they were indoctrinated by the very propaganda model that I've been talking about here into American exceptionalism, and they just can't stand to give it up. They can't stand it. They have to hold on to it. They have to hold on to it like a child holds on to a soft little teddy bear. They can't let it go. So they have to find some way to like mix that with supposedly like communism or whatever, even though it obviously contradicts everything to do with anything remotely left. To be upholding the nationalism of not just the genocidal settler colonial state, but also one of the world's principal imperialist state for 100 years now, and be like, we need to uphold its flag, we need to protect it. If anything is most likely to be a CIA op, it's that. Though, as I said, I don't think it is. I think it's very easy to explain materially. It's just a bunch of fragile Americans who can't stand critiques from people who actually know a single thing about the third world and about like the indigenous people who they dispossessed. Yeah, someone said that classically conditioned since childhood into having a vague, unexplainable, positive, subjective affect of patriotism. Yeah, basically, exactly. Like, they don't know why patriotism is good. They just think that it needs to be upheld, and anyone who's against it is a federal agent or whatever. Because, you know, they have that, basically. They have this sort of ingrained belief that American nationalism, American patriotism, or whatever is good, and that anyone who attacks it hurts their feelings. And they have like this visceral sort of primal reaction against that. So yeah, there's my rant about how if you think that someone is a federal agent, you're probably stupid, and they're almost certainly not. There's a very small chance that they aren't.